Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier. Now this is my second video on the great attacks of 1916 and 1917. This one taking a look at the Brusilov Offensive that has a lot to interest us, as Brusilov put a lot of thought behind his offensive and came up with a lot of new ideas. Remember, I'm urging you to think about 4 important questions. What was the thinking behind the strategy? What tactics were employed? And I'm adding, how was technology used? Did they show things had been learned? Yet, why weren't they successful? And finally, what were the consequences on Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, and think ahead to the war as a whole too. The Brusilov Offensive was the Russian part of the Chantilly Plan. It was an offensive on a 500-kilometre front, mostly against the Austro-Hungarians. It was intended to push them back into Galicia. It was launched on June the 4th, launched a little ahead of schedule to try and help the Italians out. So, with the Somme also brought forward a month so that the bombardment began on June the 24th, the first day of the assault on July the 1st, and an Italian attack on the Isonzo front on August the 6th, the Entente powers were at last beginning to get their act together. General Alexei Brusilov was Russia's most astute general, and with lessons learned from the Western Front, plus ideas of his own, his offensive began with a massive bombardment along the huge front using almost 2,000 guns. Like Joffre and Haig, he was convinced that this would not only confuse the enemy as to where the brunt of the attack would take place, but would allow for multiple breakthroughs, whilst not allowing the enemy the chance to fire at his own flanks. So, by dispensing with the tactic of concentrating on a small section of the enemy's defences, he didn't give the enemy the advantage of being able to concentrate its manpower as well as its own artillery. He also sent out signals intended to be intercepted, so as to mislead the enemy. He made diversionary troop movements too, so as to add to their confusion. And he made his bombardment relatively short, so as to give them no time to prepare. Trenches were prepared to jut out towards the enemy's lines. Tunnels dug too, in order to get his men as close as possible before going over the top. He also held his reserves close to the front, but sheltered out of sight in prepared dugouts, so as they would be ready to support a faltering attack, or else force through a breakthrough. He carefully trained and prepared both his gunners and his infantry, using reconnaissance photographs and scale models of the enemy's lines, and his coordination between artillery and infantry was unprecedented, with each gun battery assigned a specific task, even down to targeting individual machine gun posts. As well as the bombardment with field guns focused on the barbed wire and the heavier guns on the Austro-Hungarian defences, they were also directed to fire at command posts and road systems so as to disrupt the enemy's command and communication systems. What's more, he had the bombardment stop after 3 hours, and then resume, stop and resume again, so as to further confuse the enemy. He also dispensed with cavalry, as he felt it was useless in the face of bombardments and the machine gun. His infantry attacked in 4 waves. The first, carrying hand grenades as well as their rifles, would take the first line of trenches. The second, also with hand grenades, would push on to the second line of trenches. The third and fourth waves would consolidate the gains, bringing up their machine guns in order to do so, whilst all the time looking to smash through further. It was a great success, at least initially. He regained all the territory lost in 1915, and Austria-Hungary lost 750,000 men, dead, injured or captured. In total, 1/3 of those facing the Russians. He also captured over 200 heavy guns, almost 200 howitzers, and almost 650 machine guns. The Austrians were dealt a blow that they never recovered from. What added to the number of desertions, though, was the multinational nature of the Austro-Hungarian army. They were no longer willing to sacrifice their lives for an empire that meant nothing to them. However, much as the initial assault was a great success, on the battlefield the law of mobile warfare kicked in. The advancing army's supply lines were stretched, whilst the retreating army retreated closer to its supplies. It still could have been a decisive victory, though, but the law of Russian warfare also kicked in. The Russian government held less importance to the Galician front than their northwest front, and didn't provide replacements for the more than 1 million casualties the Brusilov Offensive had cost them. The Russian West Front army was also slow to move in and lend its support. Also, such was the scale of Russian losses that despite their victory, morale amongst the Russian troops reached a new low. Also, just 4 days into the offensive, Conrad von Hotzendorf, chief of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff, in desperation went to Berlin, asking for Germany's help. Austria-Hungary, as Falkenhayn had feared, had overextended itself. Hotzendorf received the help he desperately needed, but at a price. The end of his Italian offensive, which the Germans had always thought a waste of effort, an effort that had accounted for another 80,000 Austro-Hungarian casualties. And Austria-Hungary had to hand over control of the Austro-Hungarian army right down to its battalion and company level to the Germans. The German influence would take time to have its effect, however, and they were still suffering at Verdun and on the Somme, and so the Russians still advanced, reaching the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, but taking more and more casualties before the impetus petered out. Nevertheless, the offensive had provided some desperately needed relief for the French of Verdun, from where German troops had been sent to help the Austrians, and it left the Austro-Hungarian army close to collapse. More than the French after Verdun, Austro-Hungarian morale was shattered, and it was only German support that kept them in the war, weakening Germany in the process. Now, you can use the Brusilov Offensive to show that as early as 1916, lessons were being learned, and you can contrast it with both the German offensive at Verdun and the British offensive at the Somme, and indeed at Passchendaele the following year. So I think this should be useful for you. If you think tutorials might be useful for you, you should know the score by now. Just get your parents to get in touch with me at historymadeeasier@gmail.com, and we'll see if we can sort something out. I only charge what parents can reasonably afford. I'm in this to help. A little pocket money coming my way is all I'll want. But all this is up to you and your parents. Let me take the time to thank you for listening and wish you the best of luck with your studies. Cheers.